All right. Moving right along, because we have a lot to cover in a very short amount of time here. This is our panel on moving 1,122 stations in 39 months. I'm Allison Neplock. I'm Vice President of Spectrum Policy at the National Association of Broadcasters. Here on the panel, we have Sasha Javid, who is Chief Data Officer and Legal Advisor for the Incentive Auction Task Force at the FCC. Peter Stark from the American Tower Corporation, who's Vice President of Broadcasting at American Tower Corporation. Keith Pelletier, who is Vice President and General Manager at Dielectric. Rich Redmond, Chief Product Officer at Gates Air. And David Burke, who is VP of Technology at Raycom Media. So going right into this topic, we've heard a lot about this TSPPN, but Sasha, can you just give us a brief overview? It describes a couple of tools, the phase assignment and the phase scheduling tools. Can you talk a little bit about the inputs that you've proposed and what that PN has to say?
Sure, absolutely, Allison. And thank you for having this session. As many people have mentioned, the timing of this workshop is great because we just had a webinar on Monday, and I had to speak for about 45-50 minutes. I certainly won't do that here today, so I encourage everybody to go to the website and look at the material and the recorded video of that presentation. But it is helpful to get a little bit of an overview here before we get into the Q&A. In terms of what we were challenged to do is we had to try to find a way that we could make an orderly and efficient transition. And the approach we came up with, based on industry feedback, et cetera, was a phased approach, and more specifically, 10 phases. So that is the proposal that we put out there. And before I get into the models, I did want to touch on one other thing, which was introduced in the webinar, but I think should be clarified for those who either didn't attend or those who just maybe misinterpreted what was said. These two models that are going to be described in the webinar do not actually determine the final channel assignments. The final channel assignments is determined by the final channel optimization, which came out in another excellent PN last year, which was the bidding procedures PN. And in that bidding procedures PN, we talked about what objectives we wanted to solve for, and the primary one, most logically, is minimize or actually maximize channel keeps. So the idea is make sure if you don't have to move channels, we won't make you change your channel. But that procedure was all spelled out in the bidding procedures PN. And what this PN tries to do using these two models is try to find a way to make an orderly transition given those new channel assignments for stations. So with that, let's talk about the two tools. The first tool is the phased assignment tool. What the phased assignment tool does basically is it says, okay, given that we have to transition this many stations, let's come up with a sequence of assignments of stations to phases that meets a certain set of objectives and constraints. And those objectives and constraints, we considered a whole bunch of them. We talked to industry, got as much feedback as we could. We came up with what we thought was kind of a reasonable balance of constraints and objectives, and specifically trying to achieve a couple goals. I think the most important goal was to protect stations from undue interference during the transition. We talked about specific pairwise interference protections of 2%. We think that this is important both for transition purposes and also for the operation of the stations. So that's our number one priority, is making sure we protect those stations. Two, there's a coordination problem. I think we talked a lot about this in the webinar about daisy chains and cycles, and I do not want to get back into that today. But it does make transitioning complicated, and we had to try to, we came up with this idea of linked station sets. Linked station sets are those stations within a phase that are going to have to coordinate their testing. And we recognize that, if it's just a few stations that have to coordinate with each other, it's maybe not such a big deal. But as we showed in the webinar, the number of stations that might have to coordinate with each other during testing might be quite large. And so we wanted to minimize the size of those linked station sets. Another thing we heard basically from every broadcaster we talked to was they were really concerned about the number of rescans that people would, their viewers would have to do during the transition process. So we took that concern very seriously, and we came up with what we found was a good balance, which is stations when the DMA or the DMA is only going to have 2 transition phases assigned to it. What that means is that viewers within the DMA are only going to have to rescan twice. Another objective we did that we talked about was making sure that the phases were relatively equal sized. I think Jay might have mentioned some of the reasons why you might want to do that. I think it's logical. Just have a little bit of a distribution of stations going in any phase can help with resource allocation. And obviously, there's another side of this. I do see some wireless carriers represented here today. They're paying a lot of money for spectrum, and to the extent that we can meet these other objectives and still clear the 600 band, the new 600 band, as quickly as possible, we wanted to do that. And of course, our friends to the north and south, we had some international obligations that we had to make sure we met, so we did that. What I would say is there's actually more than that, and I won't get into all of them, but I would definitely encourage you guys to go look at the public notice, give us feedback on what you think is the right balance. I would definitely caution that they could be conflicting with each other, so just because you say, well, I only want one rescan, one transition phase for a DMA, that may actually have some significant costs in terms of the size of the coordination that you're going to have to do with other stations in terms of increasing link station sets, or the ability to even have some load balancing across the different phases. So definitely take that into account when you provide us feedback. So that's one tool. Then we have another tool, which is the phase scheduling tool. Phase scheduling tool takes the output of the phase assignment tool, which is the assignments of stations to phases, and says, okay, given this assignment, how long is this actually going to take, and how long is each phase going to take? So this phase scheduling tool is an open source event simulation software, and what it looks at is how many stations are moving and the types of stations that are moving within a phase, and also the relative availability of resources, and determines, okay, how long is that phase going to take? So a logical extension of that is what are some of those inputs that we have to take into account? Well, as we've heard from Jay and others say, I'm sure a lot of people will have feedback on that. We had to make some assumptions about the availability of certain resources and the amount of time that certain things are going to take. So, for example, the number of tower crews that are available for certain types of towers, the minimum amount of time for certain things like zoning and getting your permits. And I would say it's easy to find the exception to the rule and say, okay, well, I remember working on this one station and it took this long. Well, you have to think about the fact that we have to apply this systematically throughout to all stations in the country. So when you provide your feedback, think about something that's fair to all stations and that can be applied systematically throughout. We think we found a good balance, but we encourage people to file comments on that. So then what comes out of that? Well, what comes out of that then is some information that the FCC interprets about how long these phases are, and that'll inform our setting of the transition schedule. And this transition schedule will say, okay, this phase, that's the bar graph that you saw Jay put up there, and that's in the public notice, that says, okay, this phase is going to take this many number of weeks, and this phase is going to take this number of weeks. And it basically says, okay, how long the overall transition is going to take. And it's this information that will be put out in the auction closing and reassignment PN. At that point, we'll put out all the information, including the information about the beginning of the phase, the start date of the phase. And there was a comment about, well, why didn't we stagger the start dates? We wanted to send a clear message to stations. Your transition starts basically now, but at least by that point. And so what we say is, everybody needs to start doing certain things at least by that start date. And then we have the start of the test period. That's the point at which you can actually start to test on your future channel, your post-auction channel. And then you'll have a testing period end date, which coincides with the end of the phase. And at that point, you need to be off your original channel. So that's the information we're going to provide in that PN, and that we use the phase scheduling tool to help us create that schedule. And I do want to touch on one other point that came in, not to monopolize time too much, but there was a question that came in during the webinar that I thought was interesting, and I want to make sure that's clear. We're not telling stations, okay, you need to move, at this time with this tower crew. we talked about in the webinar that we had, the event simulation tool creates this queuing of stations, and that's how we determine how long everything takes. Well, that's for our estimates. What we really are saying is, okay, here are the dates you need to meet, and we want you to work towards filling those dates. We're not telling you how to do that. Now, naturally, because these dates are staggered, the phase completion dates are staggered, it could mean that the schedule would be, we are hoping that industry will coalesce around it and say, look, if I'm in a later phase, if I'm an equipment vendor and I've got a whole bunch of orders that come in that first 3-month window after the construction permits are granted, maybe I won't fill all my, I want to serve all my customers, but I'm going to give priority to get done the ones that are going in those earlier phases. So we hope that industry coalesces around the plan, and works towards that in the collective interest of everybody. And that's why we're putting out the schedule from the, early on, but we're not telling necessarily a station that you have to do something at a certain date. So those are the main points. I would add one last thing, which is I've been very encouraged throughout this whole process in terms of not just the consultants we've hired, who've done a terrific job, but also the broadcasters and industry stakeholders we've talked to. I mean, they basically told us they would like the FCC to take lead on this stuff, and what we're trying to do is incorporate their feedback and put out something that works for everybody.
Thank you. One other thing that we've been talking about kind of a lot is this early notice, this confidential letter that stations are going to get. How much time do you think there's going to be between when that letter gets to stations and when the CRPN comes out and everything becomes public?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. The realization came to us that we wanted to give people some more time to get their CP applications in, and that if we knew the final stage rule was met, we knew that there wasn't going to be any subsequent phases. Stages. Phases, stages, it's all blending now all together. So the thought process was, okay, let's give them a little bit more time. How much time that actually buys you, it's probably really hard to say definitively. I would say that if you're expecting a really long time because you've looked at the old SMRA auctions where you have this very long tail of bidding that goes on in small markets for a long period of time, that's probably a little bit less likely to happen under a clock auction that we're holding for the forward auction. It's just a much more relentless clock in terms of driving prices up for every market, as you see today. So I would say that but there is still the assignment phase. And the assignment phase, we haven't put out any official estimates about how long that would take. But if you're expecting many, many months, forget it, but it might buy you a couple months.
All right, thanks. So we have this panel that really represents the entire ecosystem, from station owners to tower owners to manufacturers of transmitters and antennas. So I'm going to try to go through piece by piece of the ecosystem and see how you plan to approach this 39-month deadline. So starting with the station, which I think is a logical place to start, David, let's talk about what you will do as soon as you start to get these letters and figure out what channels you're going to go to. What's your thought process? How are you going to plan at that point?
Well, I would suggest that if you waited to get your confidential letter before you start going into full speed, you've waited too late. I think we've heard that from every panel today. Sure. You should be reading every public notice and white paper and document published by the FCC, Pearl, NAD, ATSC. You should attend every webinar, meetings. These vendors and consultants all have great information on this, so you should be doing that planning now. Internally, we've already started planning. We assume a target band plan, which may be right or wrong. And I was disappointed to hear from Pamela that only 20 people have gone on to the Beta 399, because I had a call with every one of our chief engineers just last week and said, every one of you will assume that you will be repacked. I don't care if you're the low V, high V, low U, you will be repacked, assume it, go in and fill out the 399. So I'm at least hoping that if she goes in there and looks who it was, that 19 of those were Raycom Media employees. I know I will be sending an email later this afternoon.
If they're watching now, they'll be doing it this afternoon.
Hopefully they're on the 399. So we have regularly scheduled meetings. We're already discussing this. It was mentioned earlier about making sure your inventory is correct. It's also just simple things like, can you log into the LMS? We have confirmed that every one of our stations can log in the LMS. They know the password, go through the 399, which is on a beta site, but it's the same username and password. And then procedurally, what we plan on doing between the confidential letter and the public notice is, well, really the 3-month period is we're going to have a 3-stage review of the 399 because it's imperative that the 399 be filled out correctly. So we have, because we're a large group, obviously we have a chief engineer at every TV station. We call him a director of technology, forward-thinking concept. So they will fill out month 1, they go in and do the 399. Month 2, the regional, we have regionals assigned over TV stations, regional engineers. They will review and do month 2, and then month 3, the almighty corporate will go in and we'll review, and we'll be the ones that hit submit. We already have the expertise really in-house. We're very familiar with the CP process, so we'll do that at the corporate level. So that's what we plan on doing when the I was going to say when the bomb hits, but
Okay, great. And so then I guess I'll toss it on to Rich as sort of the next piece of the ecosystem. When you start to get those orders for transmitters, when stations start to contact you, maybe not even with orders, but just with inquiries, how are you going to be able to prioritize and figure out how to attack the scope of this problem?
Yeah, good question. To kind of build on the planning process just outlined, we've done some site surveys for a lot of our customers to help them understand what's there, what the capability of the equipment that's installed that could be moved or retuned, in some cases helping them get someone to help them do a tower analysis. So the more we can get them prepared, and then kind of outlining, okay, I think I'm going to have 10 or 5 or some number of stations that get moved, and then we have a pretty good view of what we think that's going to be. We kind of plan that in with our material planning process and our factory allocation process. So, over the past year, we've spent a lot of time, you might say house cleaning. Over a long period of time, you kind of tend to accumulate a lot of stuff. So some of it is just make sure we've got plenty of room in the factory to do multiple things at the same time. Others priming the supply chain. But really at a basic level, some years ago we started with the premise that transmitters generally needed to be broadband and easily retuned. So as compared to during the DTV conversion where, Jay kind of outlined different things that were frequency specific, the fact that, one group can order transmitters and really the only difference between the other, as long as they're in the same band, is we set the power and we set the frequency. So, the architecture investment we've made over the past several years kind of puts us in a position where it's a lot easier to determine where it's going and what station it's for towards the end of the process, as opposed to having a 16 or 32-week lead time on really critical frequency determined components.
Great. So Keith, I think the story might be a little bit different when you get to antennas, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we look at the PN, we're talking about almost 2,000 stations having to do something, right? Because we're talking about the 1,200 stations that have to move, and then the 800, 900 interim transitional antennas, whatever you want to talk about. So from our perspective, I have a high tolerance of pain. I'm also very excitable, and I'm ready for that gun to go off and ready to get going. My team knows that. We're ready to go. But how can we separate the two to make it a little bit easier is certainly one question that we're looking at. But one thing that we've been able to do, if you look at the percentage of those 1,200 stations on the main stick that are going to have to change channel, there are a lot of things like Rich just stated that we have for product in the portfolio today that we didn't for the DTV transition, which is a lot more broadband product, high power band tunable filters, which with the supply chain and all the other things that you can get ready for will be ready for that. But as the audience knows, a good portion of those 1,200 stations are going to be either single frequency, highly directional, specific patterns, which makes dielectric's job a lot more intensive. So, what we've been doing is looking at the 90-day window. How do we optimize and help out the consulting community with programs to quickly get them the data that they need right off the bat? We've put a lot of work into that. We're also looking at engineering and manufacturing processes that are a lot more efficient, but maintain the quality that we've had for many, many decades. One advantage I believe that dielectric has is where we did about 70 to 75% of the initial DTV rollout. We have a lot of experience both in manufacturing and engineering that I am currently putting a lot of pressure on my team to maximize to be able to get through this and take this challenge on.
So in the PN, the FCC said that they were hopeful that manufacturers would be able to use the phase scheduling tools, or the output, in order to help guide their manufacturing capacity. How feasible is that, and what do stations need to do to actually help them?
That's a great question. I think if you look at the PN and some of the phases, I don't know the phases offhand, but say phase 4, phase 5, everything gets going right away. The start date's the same, and then if you have 250 antennas that are separated by 5 business days, maybe 8 business days, to a manufacturer, that's really the same phase. I mean, because you're going to get going on that. There are some things that we probably can do to help, but if we get all the orders at once, the manufacturers, it's a first in, first out type of deployment, right? So our engineering team is the first on the line that's going to get through those. If they're already 6 weeks into a design, and then we get orders for an earlier phase, it becomes really challenging. You can't just automatically jump that guy out in front.
Great. Okay. So moving on to
Okay,
the.
just
Oh,
interrupt.
yeah, sure.
I mean, this is actually an extremely important point, which goes to getting in your orders in place so that a vendor can actually start to work towards the schedule as he sees it to fulfill those orders. So it's in the station's interest. I mean, that's one of the reasons we said the phase starts at day 1, at day 0 for everybody, is that we want people to take the perspective that it's going to be in everybody's interest to get in those orders as quickly as possible, and then it's certainly up to the equipment vendors to help fulfill that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, to Sasha's point, right? If Dielectric gets all the orders on day 1, we'll certainly work with the FCC to make sure that we're working towards those guidelines.
Right.
It's just a matter of if it all doesn't happen at once, then we're kind of stuck.
Yeah, that's same with the transmitters. The sooner you know what everybody's going to need, the much easier it is to have an orderly process to go get them all done on time, right?
So Peter, onto your part of the ecosystem, the towers. This is likely the most expensive and time-consuming part of the transition for many stations if they have to do major tower work. What are you doing now, and what can you do as soon as you learn the schedule to help make that happen as smoothly as possible in 39 months?
So I'll just give you an idea on the breadth of our challenge at American Tower. We have over 350 full power and Class A leases on American Tower assets. And we estimate, based on the latest spectrum clearing target and the public notices out there, we estimate probably north of 150 stations will be repacked on our assets. So think about that and what has to be done within a relatively short period of time during the 90-day period from cost estimates, because we know what we know out there. We know that antennas will be required. We know that David wants replication of coverage as best as possible. Rich knows, is going to team up with the antenna manufacturer, his customer, and also with his consulting engineer. And they're coming up and they're going to devise a scheme that then they're going to bring to us if they're on our tower. And we have to be part of that ecosystem as part of the application for construction permit process. If you notice, I said over 350 stations, maybe 150 towers out there. So we have a lot of multiple repack tenants on certain assets out there. These stations can't go out and make decisions on their own without getting together as a group and coming up with a plan out there. So it's going to be quite challenging on our part. So we know that there's an antenna that has to be fabricated. We know there's a transmitter. We know there's replication of coverage. We need to know all of that along with a consulting engineer in order to determine what's going to happen on the tower. And we can't even start looking at a true reimbursement cost until we get that information, run structural analysis out there. Okay? So that's sort of what we're faced with today. But what we have been doing over the past year, even before the declaratory ruling out there, is we've been preparing for this day. A lot of us here are veterans of the analog to digital transition, and people say to me, well, what best practices and comparisons do you have? Well, there's not a whole lot out there because we built new towers out there and we had 10 years to do it. Simulcast stations, and we knew what channels there were out there. So what I thought was a difficult process back then, and zoning and regulatory was much different back then than it is today. So much different process today that we have to work with. So we're trying to get ahead of the knowns and we'll deal with the unknowns when everybody comes out with the channel allocations and the equipment. What I depend on within American Tower is actually comes from the wireless side of our business out there. We've seen for the past 5 years the map wars on TV. You know, who has the best coverage? Who went from 3G to 4G out there, right? Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, everybody out there trying to build out as fast as they can to get ahead of the curve for their 4G process. As part of that, there's been this sort of services ecosystem that's been built up, and even within American Tower, called a site acquisition, zoning, permitting process, which basically takes a tower asset all the way from application on a tower, all the way through zoning, permitting, to notice to proceed, and also through structural modifications on a tower. So we've taken the best practices that actually have come out of the wireless industry, because a tower is a tower when it comes to zoning and permitting out there. Actually, we're in better shape with broadcast towers because most broadcast towers aren't located in residential areas, and that's where wireless carriers try to build today. So we're taking best practices on the wireless from the wireless side of the business, and we're applying them to the broadcast side of the business. So what we've done is we've developed a war room. So we're actually going to have a war room mentality and a war room setup, and we're out now circulating our services program with all the broadcasters out there to basically give them the easy button. And our services program closely matches, and that's why we're interested in taking a look at the new catalog that's out there. We want to make sure that our services program matches the catalog of reimbursement, eligible expenses out there. So that way, broadcasters will have a reasonable assurance that they're collecting the right numbers during the 90-day period to get their cost estimates in place. And then when we look at and what we're doing also now is we're looking at baseline structural analysis, because I do believe in the phased approach here. We are going to see a lot of interim or auxiliary antennas pressed into service in order to meet some of the first phases out there that you will need some type of interim antenna or auxiliary antenna. And what I say to a lot of people is, well, people say interim antenna or temporary antenna. If you're going to put up a perfectly good antenna, why not leave it on the tower afterwards? And another thing you have to think about is future. If you look at 3.0, if you flash forward to 3.0, 3.0, we talk a lot about flex use. Broadcasters talk about a lot of flex use. So they're going to have a whole separate set of clientele out there using their spectrum. They're going to want redundancy and reliability. So if you're putting up say a broadband antenna, which is a big part of our program out there, if you're putting one up, even as part of a transition solution out there, leave it up on your tower. Even if it's your tower, an American Tower, consider leaving it up as part of the transition plan, making sure that's in the structural analysis when you do that work. So we're going to be as prepared as possible. We're going to know all the knowns that we can, and the unknowns, we'll just deal with them when the time comes with the channel allocations out there.
Okay, so assuming all of this is great, the supply chain is flowing, the stations have planned, the towers are ready to go, everything is done. We're still looking at a case where there are going to be a lot of stations that are going to need to do something on the same day. Sasha's talked about limiting the linked station sets to at most 125. That's what the PN proposes. But still, we're going to have cases where a lot of stations will need to do a flash cut on the same day. Is that a problem? Is 125 too many to move at the same day? Is that not a problem, and you could do 400? What's the reality there?
Well,
Everybody's
Sasha,
looking
do you
at me,
want to
but,
take Okay.
If I could tie together maybe just a couple of conversations. And I know Sasha said that they're not requiring broadcasters to align with certain dates on manufacturing, and the manufacturers talked about FIFO. But if we're diligent as a broadcaster and we take 90 days to do our Form 399 because we really want to make sure it's right, and others decide that they're going to order equipment and submit their stuff in month one, and they get ahead of the chain, there's got to be some honoring of this queue and phase concept by the manufacturers. And by the way, I'll just remind Keith, when we were in the break, you did say any Raycom media antenna would be put to the front of the production line. So it seems to me that I know we all don't want to admit that or acknowledge that, but that has to be honored. This whole thing is very fragile. If everything goes off perfectly, then it'll work, but it's almost like a Jenga or Yanga, whatever you call that game. And if one little block comes off, it's going to have a ripple effect throughout the entire phases. It seems to me that there does, on the manufacturing side, have to be some recognition of this phased approach and honor this in the queue process.
I mean, my personal opinion is I don't think Dielectric would object if everybody got their orders in right away, so.
Can we start getting them today?
Yeah, I mean, that's really not uncommon in other rollouts we've done in other countries, right? Where even we have multiple broadcasters who place an order for a number of transmitters, and we need to schedule delivery based on whether they're regions or zones in the country. So, I think the key is if if everybody gets, in what they need to get in early, and we look against the schedule of which regions and zones go at which period of time, then it's a lot of work to get done in a short period of time, but it's fairly straightforward to start prioritizing those based on who needs to get done first.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly going to be some collaboration, right? I mean, if to David's point, if everything happens within the first 90 days, that's easy for us to go out and make sure we're a systematic approach. My concern would be is if some of those orders come way beyond the 90 days, and then it's a FIFO type environment. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that we haven't really discussed, and I know the next session goes into it a little bit, but we talked about the 2,000 stations. I know the groups within Pearl and Sinclair, they're going to, ATSC 3.0 probably doesn't line up at the same exact point in time, but it does line up through that 39-month window, whether it's more trials, more testing in major markets, and that's just going to make that station count go up. So again, the emphasis there is the more pre-planning that we can do, or more manufacturing of stuff up front that helps alleviate some of that time in advance is certainly going to alleviate some headaches. Albeit we'll take them, but how do we make it a little bit more easier for everybody in this transitional approach?
Yeah, my thinking is most of the 90 days will be required in order for you to come up with an accurate estimated cost submittal, especially if you're on a tower that's a complex tower out there and you have to coordinate with other broadcasters, because again, you just can't go out and come up with a solution on your own out there. It has to be as a group. The biggest unknown here is really tower modification. Truly is. You think about it. We're not going to be able to even run a structural analysis on a tower until everybody gets together and decides what antenna, what pattern, what azimuth, everything together. And until that's done, the structural analysis can't be complete. We talk a lot about tower crews, and we have talked about structural engineering firms out there, but there's a limited number of structural engineering firms out there that can do this type of work on the taller towers. So if we want as accurate as possible reimbursement submittals out there, then you're going to need the majority of the 90 days in order to complete that.
So we all lived through the DTV transition in one respect or another, and I'm sure we all have some horror stories from things that went wrong. And hopefully hopefully nothing goes wrong, but in reality something will. Does anybody want to give any stories about some specific problems and how they were mitigated and how they were addressed so that you can prepare for the unknown at this stage?
It was 100% smooth for Dielectric.
Any alternative viewpoints?
I will say that from Raycom Media's perspective, we still have the same core RF engineers in place at Raycom Media that were involved in the DTV transition. And I would say DTV transition was different. It was transitioning technologies, and you had both channels up and running at the same time. It was a 10-year period or whatever. And this is much more compressed, and you're staying within the same technology. So I feel very comfortable from that perspective, because we still have, if you know these guys, Bob Thurber and Eric Bourbon and Roger Hatfield are some of the most experienced RF guys that a company could have that's not at a consulting firm. So I feel very comfortable there. We've also, fortunate or not, we've had kind of two dry runs, so to speak. We had a Channel 51 and Channel 31 change that we did in the last 6 months. That's like a repack. And we had a tower fall in Lubbock that we had to build from the ground up. And so we've had a couple of dry runs, so we're ready. We're chomping at the bit here.
So no glitches. Everything was smooth
Never.
for the entire. Okay.
And we're not a public
It's a
company.
different regulatory world, though, than the analog, as I mentioned earlier, the analog to digital transition. So most municipalities did not have tower zoning rules and regulations during most of the analog to digital transition. Thanks to our wireless brethren out there and the confluence of thousands of wireless towers being built, almost every municipality now has some type of tower regulatory, zoning code out there. So I would encourage everybody that owns their own tower out there, that's one thing that you should really take a hard look at. If you own your land, you should find out if most towers when they were originally built were built under conditional use permits or special use permits. Go back and take a look at those permits to make sure, number one, they didn't run out and you have to renew those. And look what you have in the way of, what you can do under that original permit and seeing if it has to be modified. The good news here is that for the most part, we're changing out antennas. We're not adding a whole bunch of new equipment to the tower. I hope, and somebody had brought up the FAA earlier, during the analog to digital transition, all the towers that we built, we maximized FAA height. So we only have a certain amount of aperture to work with when we're looking at these new antennas. You're not going to remove a cantilever structure to create more aperture in a tower. You're not going to lower the tower height on one of the major complex towers out there. You may be able to do it with a single frequency antenna on the top of the tower, reduce the height of the tower, but you're not going to do it on these bigger structures out there. So my word is get out, know all of the regulations that you're bound by your sites that you own.
So, knowing now that it looks like we're going to have well over 1,000 stations that need to be repacked during the repack transition, how comfortable are each of you? And I'll go down the line. I'll start with Sasha, who I'm sure is going to say 100% sure. But how comfortable are you that we're going to be able to complete this in 39 months?
I think the answer is we have to be confident. You have to aim high and set the bar high. It's going to be a challenge. There's no question that there's a lot of things that we had to make some simplifying assumptions just in terms of getting time estimates. But I don't think anything that at least we've heard is totally insurmountable. And yes, there may be some outside case examples where there might be some issues with permitting or zoning, and the plan is the plan, but it's not to say that there could be a case or where extraordinary circumstances warrant where we could accommodate something. And for example, when you look at the daisy chains, stations in the Northeast or in the Midwest, they're generally part of a much longer daisy chain that, as you see, it can extend to Canada. When you talk about daisy chains on the West Coast or mid-central part of the country, those daisy chains tend to be shorter. So what does that mean? Well, there actually may be a little bit more flexibility for those stations just by virtue of geography and then the population density. In terms of coming back to us, to the FCC, and saying, look, we know that you have us in phase 5, 6, and 7, but we really want to be in 8, 9, and 10. Let's hold off the 9 and 10 because we want to get the wireless guys. But assuming, let's say 3, 4, 5, and they want to move to 5, 6, 7, it's more likely that something could be granted there. Now, we still have to look holistically at what does that do for demand of resources. You don't want to have a huge set of stations in a certain market come and say, look, we want to move to phase 1 or phase 2 because we want to just get this done with. If it means taking away resources from other stations that we know have to go in those first phases. So, the FCC's bottom line is the plan, and everybody should work towards that plan. But we don't live in a bubble. We know that there might be some exceptions, and Barbara is over there, and she's nodding her head. So,
Peter?
So I think everybody knows we've been out promoting broadband antenna use, not just for the final solution for new channels, but also for the transition solution. And this new phased approach that just came out in the PN just reinforces the need for transitional antennas, and preferably broadband type transitional antennas in order for us to meet some of the shorter cutover timelines. So we're fairly, and the other advantage we have is in a lot of major markets we have multiple broadcast towers in those markets. So we can look at playing one tower off of the other tower, where a transition antenna for stations on Tower A can be the transition antenna can be located on Tower B, preferably in a comparable or near comparable position where they can get decent coverage out of a transition antenna. So we're coming up bottom line is we're coming up with different scenarios using transitional and permanent broadband antenna solutions. And I forgot to mention, we're the largest owner and operator of broadband antennas in the United States today. We have over 70 antennas, broadband antennas. 29 of those are UHF antennas. So now all of a sudden with this new transition plan, we're starting to receive and open up greater dialogue regarding the use of those existing broadband antennas. What's their true broadband capability? What's their current power handling threshold in those antennas? So we're trying to look to use as much infrastructure as possible, trying to think outside the box, but definitely using a transitional type approach. So at least we can come to a reasonable, I wouldn't say guarantee, but assurances that stations can meet their phased cutover date.
All right, and let's try to speed it up a little bit so we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience, but your take on 39 months?
I would just say that's, that from the FCC mandate, that's what my senior management team is looking at every single day. We're challenging the paradigms, we're challenging the history, and not only just in engineering, but like I said, manufacturing, supply chain, all the way down the line. And just to add to what David said, I trust in my engineering team 100%. We're ready to go. I believe we're the best in the industry, and we're also very fortunate that we had a bunch of core resources that are no longer with us from the DTV transition that are willing to come back and work for me, and they're very strong and on the spot, getting ready to meet the demands, and they hit the ground running. So we're marching towards it. Are there some things that we're concerned about, or some things that may throw a curveball at us? Absolutely, but we're marching towards it.
Yeah, I think, you got to start with the premise that you're going to make it, because if you don't start with that, then, you'll never get there, right? But I think from our standpoint, the fact we've got easily tunable products, we've been, queuing the factory up to get throughputs much faster than certainly in the old days. We've just done some development on a portable transmission facility. So, in some of these interim sites, you could possibly wheel up a trailer that has a transmitter in it and, use it for the time that you need. And I think, building on what you'd said earlier, it's people. And so when you got great people in place, and we've got, some great engineers, excellent service guys, they're really able to help facilitate things. So we're confident we'll get our part done, but realize that everyone needs to work together to get to the end result.
Two answers. I feel for the people reason that Raycom will do 100%. I think if I was to project what the industry will do, I would give it a 70% chance. And I don't mean 70% of the stations, it's 70% chance. And I would base that earlier on my comments about the Jenga building blocks, that one little thing crumbles there and it's going to ripple through. I think that perhaps we have underestimated the pre-construction phases, as Peter mentioned earlier, about tower construction, tower mods, line sweeps, structural analysis. I think that we're assuming that those will happen quicker than they really do in reality. And my prediction has nothing to do with the FCC and everything to do with just the whole concept. I echo Patrick's remarks about the FCC. Any interactions I've had with the FCC, everybody's been professional, responsive, helpful, insightful, the whole thing. I just think 39 months is tight, but not for Raycom.
Okay. All right, we have time for just a couple questions, from one or two questions from the audience, so if they're quick.
Thank you. As a veteran of the Denver Tower, which took an actual act of Congress to build, is there a possibility, and has the FCC considered some sort of interagency advocacy? So what I mean by that is a methodology where we can use the FCC and this transition as a focal point to streamline interagency communications, for instance, FAA, for instance, import restrictions for raw materials and manufactured materials coming from overseas. There's a dozen things, everything to work permits, streamline visa work permits. I mean, there's many things that get hung up in the process. I mean, maybe Rich needs a whole bunch more pallets for his transmitters from Malaysia, but they're hung up in the State Department somewhere because somebody went on vacation and doesn't know which box to check. It would be extremely helpful if the FCC could take a lead in creating this advocacy so that when we see problems, we have a single point where we go to Sasha and say, Sasha, the FAA has been dragging their heels for a month on this thing, and we're dying here.
Yeah, Sasha's pointing his
Okay.
finger.
If
Do
there was
you
any
wanna
way to
phone a friend
address
on
that,
this,
that
or
would
do
be
you
great.
have an answer?
Yeah, in this case, I might take that. I mean, I do think the agency has thought about it. I don't know how many concrete steps, and maybe Gene can answer more definitively. I mean, I think we're looking at all these things. For example, the tower crew thing came up when we were talking with Canada. You know, one of their concerns was how easy is it for tower crews for Canada to get into the U.S. and do work, and we actually worked through those issues. But more generally, to Duran's questions about Bureau of Land Management and the FAA issue, I don't know what we've done to facilitate exactly, and maybe Gene can answer that one more definitively. But
Come up here, Gene, for a second.
These are not questions of first impression, obviously, and we've given a lot of thought to it. We're developing outreach plans now. You know, our Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau is looking at this. We're looking at it, and we're going to be doing a lot of that. And obviously, just as Duran was saying, if things run up in the permit process, come to us. Barbara said this any number of times during the webinar. Come to us with the problems. We're going to try to help. I mean, this is a cooperative effort, and we're going to try to help as much as we can. We have no control over other federal agencies, I hasten to say, but we certainly do have. We'll use whatever good offices we have to be able to streamline and help them understand the importance of this project.
Thanks, Gene. I think we've run over our time, but thank you, panelists, for a great panel. And next up is ATSC 3.0.